And they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. That phrase begins in the early part of our gospel for this evening. And it's the end of the gospel that we had last week. The journey, the road to Emmaus, the journey to Emmaus, the two disciples walking, and as they're walking along 7 miles in the wrong direction. 7 miles away from Jerusalem, where everything had happened, everything was going to happen, and they're headed 7 miles in the other direction. They're lost, they're not sure, they got a lot of questions. And this guy walks along with them, answers questions for them. But they're just asking questions. At one point, they reach their destination and say, hey, you want supper? And he comes in and joins them, and they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. I think that's very important, because you and I are here this evening for Mass, and breaking bread is something that we do not only here at the altar, but we do it in our homes, we do it out at restaurants, we do it all over the place. Somehow or another, the ritual of coming together for a meal is very important to us. We use it to mark every major event. You know, you have a funeral, there's always a meal afterwards. You have a wedding, there's a meal afterwards. You have a baptism, there's always a party. Hopefully next year at your confirmation, there'll be a party afterwards and you'll break bread. That experience of sharing a meal is something that somehow or another strikes a very deep chord. I mean, let's face it, in the world that we live in, at least here in Central Coast, California, if you all come to confirmation, you know, or you all come to a celebration and there's no meal afterwards, well, you're just going to go to McDonald's anyway. I mean, it's not like you're going to faint from hunger on the way home. You know, if we don't feed you, you won't make it. Breaking bread, somehow or another, brings us together in a way like nothing else. There's not a lot of you, there's a couple of you here that are about my age or older or somewhere around there. And there were no McDonald's in those days. You know, you came home and you were home in time for supper. In my house, it was 5:30. You know, and it was every night. And you were home. And if you weren't home, you didn't eat. Needless to say, I didn't miss too many of them. But, you know, if you came home, supper was at 5:30, and you came home at 6:45, tough. There was no McDonald's to go to, and the thought of just opening up the fridge to rummage through the fridge, no. You took your life in your hands. Mom said, you're here, be on time. You don't want to be on time? Starve. There was that sense of breaking bread together. Of course, you could always go next door. But, you know, if your friends invited you over for dinner, the first question was, what do you have? You know, and you check to see, you kind of did a comparison. Who was the better cook and who had the better meal? But there was this sense of coming together as family to sit down and break bread. And in that experience, we knew that something special was happening. And we lose a lot of that because we do things very differently today. But I really would encourage you, at least once a week, you know, at least once a week, sit down to meal together. If you do it at home, if you do it out at a restaurant, if you order in, if you defrost it, whatever it is, at least once a week, sit down to a meal together. Because it's in that experience of sitting around the table, of sharing stories. So how'd your day go? You know, what was it like? What's going on in your life? It's in sharing those stories that we come to hear the power and the strength and the movement of God in our lives. Without that, we're a poor people. Without that, we miss what's really going on. Even if you're a family of one, you know, I make it a point that I obviously live alone, at least 2 or 3 times a week to cook and sit down. I hate cooking for just one person, but to cook and sit down and not just, you know, quick wolf it down in front of the TV, but to sit down and eat a regular meal. Obviously, I eat it 2 or 3 times a week, but that's beside the point. We share in that experience. We understand the gracious act of God in our life. And we come to understand the depth of the love of God as given to us in the fruit of the earth, as given to in the fruit of family, as given to us in the fruit of friendship, and all of those relationships that become bonded around the dinner table. Because that's then reflected when we come here to Eucharist. Eucharist almost makes no sense to us if you break it away from the table. It just becomes this sacred event that we do, but we're really not sure what to do with it. It's only when we can identify it as a meal, not something separate from, but incorporated into. The Last Supper was dinner. The Last Supper was that time. It was a Passover meal, but it was supper. And people came together and shared the story of the salvation of the Hebrew people. And so we come together in this Eucharist and share the story of our people as we are saved in baptism, confirmed, and nurtured in Eucharist. We share those stories. And this makes sense for us in the experience of sharing a meal. And so I would invite you to do 2 things. First of all, sometime this week, sit down to dinner together. Share stories over that meal. Talk to each other over that meal. But second, do this in memory of him. Because we do this in memory of the Christ who loved us to the cross and who carried us into resurrection. And we recognize him living among us in the breaking of